organized by the Center for Teaching, Learning and Pedagogy, which is where I come from, and we know some of you, and some of you know us. So very glad to see those familiar faces here, and very glad to also welcome those whom we are encountering each other for the first time. My name is Alvin. Together with Yun Yi, I'm not sure if she's on screen, we will be your admin/moderating team for today. I'll be introducing our speaker in a bit. You do see the title of our webinar on differentiated instructions screen. I'll say more a little bit about that in a bit. Meantime, apologies in advance that you have to put up with the boring bits, so basically the housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared after this session, after we've had a chance to tidy up, in case there are aspects of today's session that you would like to reflect further on. We also love to hear your comments and questions. By we, I mean both us as well as our speaker for today. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along. If you see something that someone else has said that really resonates with you, please thumbs that up. Our speaker hopes to be able to address some of these as we go along, particularly the ones that most resonate. So your thumbs up will help us in that. Otherwise, we do have a question and answer segment at the end where you have the opportunity to surface questions by turning on a mic. Perhaps come that time, you could just use the raise hands function to get our attention so that we can give the time over to you to do that. In true Singapore tradition, something that's good must be and free and must share, right? Or must share. So what you see up on screen here is a shout out to our umbrella office Inspire and the teaching and learning related resources that they've put together. Feel free to scan it as I speak now if you're keen to subscribe or to check out these various resources. A number of them relate to the hot potato topic of the moment in teaching and learning, meaning namely the use of Gen AI. So do scan the QR code and leave that screen open for your leisurely review later. Advance heads up also as well to everybody that we will be releasing a feedback QR code in the last quarter or so of the session. If you do need extra reason to fill up this short form, our speaker actually has put in some questions regarding some insights that she will hope to be able to obtain from all of you that are relevant to her work and research on today's topic of differentiated instructions. So I'm sharing this now with advance apologies because the feedback link might suddenly pop up in the chat in the last quarter of the session. As we try to catch those who may need to leave on the dot or just before due to other engagement. All right, so that's me and the boring bit over. So now comes to the exciting, courtesy of our invited speaker, Associate Professor Tang. Dr. Heng has done extensive research and work in the area of differentiated instructions, hence the name of today's webinar, particularly how it supports inclusiveness and community building. And she does this, I suppose, as part of her portfolio in policy, curriculum, and leadership with the National Institute of Education. I'll be saying a little bit more, but maybe as I do that, I can stop sharing so that Dr. Heng, you can start setting up also as well as I round up your introductions. So let me just do that. Okay. As Dr. Heng is setting up, just like to also share that most recently she has been investigating the intersection of differentiated instructions with technology-based pedagogical innovations. What that means is, she's taking a closer look at how technology is impacting learners in higher education, and perhaps how we, in our capacities and involvements in higher education, might be able to better use such pedagogical innovations and in context of differentiated instructions. So I see that Dr. Heng has her slides all set up. So maybe over to you to share your research findings and insights on this. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure everyone is as well. Dr. Heng?
Great. Thank you very much, Alvin. Hello, everybody. TGIF. Thank goodness you're here with me on a Friday. I was joking with Alvin and Yuan Yong about, folks coming in on a Friday, usually for PDs. Okay, so as Alvin has very kindly introduced me, I'm actually at the Nanyang, yes, of course, I'm at Nanyang Technological University. I'm across the road at the National Institute of Education in Singapore. And then for the work that I do spend quite a lot of time looking at Singapore teachers' practices of differentiated instruction in the primary and secondary school setting. And it's because when I look at how they actually implement that in school, and because I teach a module on that, it has me wondering about how can I actually use some of these philosophies and ideas in my own practice in higher education as well? And so that's how this research came about. Okay, so I'm going to. Okay, so just going to give some quick background for the study. So I explained earlier that the reason why I wanted to research this is because of my other research in Singapore schools around differentiated instruction. So I really want to see how this plays out in a higher education setting. But at the same time, I'm also being confronted with a very practical issue in my classroom. Because I've noticed that in the 10 years that I've been around, right, that there's been a change in my classroom composition. So what I start seeing, okay, in my classroom is that I start seeing there's an increasing diversity in the number of students, okay, which actually makes teaching a bit more challenging for me. In the beginning years when I first started, sorry, it was 9 years, not 10 years ago, 9 years ago when I first started, my classroom space, there were a lot of MOE teachers. But as the years progressed, I realized that the MOE teachers become fewer and fewer. And now there are a lot more teachers from different kind of backgrounds. We have like nurse educators, military educators, educators working in any of the Institute of Higher Education in Singapore, as well as international students as well. So all of them come with very, very different needs. So this then has me thinking, okay, what can I do in my own classrooms then, particularly for my graduate level classrooms, which experience a lot of this kind of different kinds of diversity. So this diversity across students also poses the challenges in terms of mutual communication. Communication in the sense of, for example, the cleavage between international students and domestic students, they are not interacting as much as I want them to. Cleavages along the lines of those who are working in MOE setting versus those in the private industry and so on and so forth. So because of that, I do want to try to mix them up a bit to see what can I do in a classroom so that there's a lot more interactions. And then the third issue is that of a more academic issue, in a sense that there's a lot of research talking about differentiated instruction in the primary and secondary setting, but a lot less in the higher education setting. So I really wanted to contribute to this this gap in the research around, what would differentiated instruction look like in higher education, and what can we do about it? In higher education, what does happen is that faculty members would say that, okay, the class size is big, they do not have enough time to prepare for this, research is of more important. So these are some of the challenges with implementing differentiated instruction in the higher education setting. So with that in mind, I had two goals to my work, okay? So the first goal of my work is to actually explore how EdTech or education technology enhanced differentiated instruction can be used to support diverse students. I'll talk a little bit more about the EdTech piece in a couple of slides on later. Okay, so stay with me now as I talk about what DI means first. Okay. And then the second goal is to then, so the first goal really is for me to play around, okay? It's for me to play around my own practice to see, hey, what are some of these things that I could do in the classroom, in my own classroom in higher education? The second goal is to actually understand next then, okay, given that I'm implementing these practices in my classroom, how then are my students experiencing these EdTech enhanced DI practices, including international students, right? And I pay attention to this piece about international students because that's another line of my research. I do have another line of research beyond DI, which looks into international student mobility and international students' experiences in higher education. So about the context of this study then. So as I mentioned, I researched on differentiated instruction in the Singapore primary and secondary school system. At NIE, I also teach a master's level class on differentiated instruction. So the context is my class, which is a master's level course on DI, which is usually taught over one semester, right? But data was collected over 2 rounds of the course. So I'll be sharing data from 2 rounds of the course later. And this course, so it's the multi-layer to this, okay? So this course that I'm teaching is actually on DI. So what then I'm doing at the same time is to role model how DI can be used for students so that they experience DI themselves. So there are many, many layers involved. Okay, so what exactly is differentiated instruction? So I draw mostly from Tomlinson's work because it is touted as the leading model by some scholars because of its user-friendliness in terms of its framework, as well as the way in which it's broken up into various analytic components. Okay, so in a way, the idea of DI not just frames the way in which I teach in the classroom, it is also the content in which my students are learning. DI also frame the research, the way in which I actually research, okay, and how I put together part of the framework of my own research as well. So what is differentiated instruction? I want to show this picture here of the 3 pillars of effective differentiation here first, okay? Because I want to show this because I think what happens very often is that we tend to, in a Singapore setting, associate DI merely with practices. Okay, and that is one myth, okay, that I see very often in the classroom. That immediately when teachers think about differentiated instruction, they think straight away at what the strategies and the practices are. And in their minds, they're thinking, oh, okay, DI will be tiered instruction, flexible grouping, a station rotation, learning stations, and so on and so forth. All right. But what I really want to draw us to are these 2 columns here, which is the philosophy and the principles of DI. So there are 4 main philosophies undergirding DI. The first one, which I would say is an extremely important one, is the one that says that we have to regard diversity as normal and valuable. Okay, firstly, we got to appreciate and accept that our students are diverse and that it's normal and that we value it. And if we actually begin with the assumption in mind that, their diversity is valuable, I can do something about it, then we will actually at the same time, we can actually also focus on a growth mindset. Okay, so while we also appreciate that diversity as normal and valuable, the next philosophy is premised on the assumption that we believe that all our students can learn. So it's premised on a growth mindset that they can learn with the right strategies and support. Okay. And then with that, the third one, therefore, is that we then accept responsibility for the maximum progress of our learners. Okay. So instead of thinking, oh, okay, they can't get it, they just can't get it, it's thinking, okay, so if they can't get it, how can I teach it in another way such that they can get it? Okay, so it's accepting responsibility for their progress. And finally, it is to remove any barriers to equity, okay, that will, especially, that will stop access for marginalized learners. So the ones who are more marginalized could be the ones who may not be linguistically as strong, could be your international students, minority students, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are the 4 philosophies I really would like us to really think about because, and I spent time talking about these because eventually later on, despite the practices that I shared, some of them could be useful for you that you can take away. Some of them may not be useful in your personal context. But I think what then happens is to think through these philosophies and practice, to think through, okay, if I use these DI philosophies and practice, if I couldn't use some of the practices that Tang had shared earlier, how can I apply some of these principles or philosophies? So the 5 principles undergird effective differentiation. The first one is environment as a catalyst for learning, which means the classroom environment, we try to set up the classroom environment to be as safe and as supportive as possible, right? So students feel safe in that space and they feel respected within that. And secondly is a foundation of quality curriculum, which is that we're providing curriculum which is authentic, relevant to their needs. And then the third is using assessment to inform teaching and learning. And I'm going to say that this piece is actually what I think is a very critical piece for differentiated instruction. And people don't pay attention to it because they often think they hear the word differentiated instruction and they think that it's all about instruction or teaching or pedagogical practices. But I'm going to argue actually that assessment is critical. It's like the flip side of this instruction because we cannot teach without having had assessment data to know where our students are at. And if we don't know where they're at and what they're lacking, then we can't plug that gap. So assessment is absolutely critical in differentiated instruction. And then the fourth one, therefore, is with the assessment data, formative assessment data that we have collected, how then can we feed it forward to change our instruction according to their needs? And then finally, it is in leading and managing a flexible classroom. Okay, so these are the 5 principles. And oftentimes I'm asked, okay, how do I know whether I have DI in the classroom? Then I will always tell teachers, okay, maybe what you can do is to go back to thinking about the principles. To what extent do you see these principles showing up in your practices in the classroom? That then, in a way, you can talk about how much or to what extent you are incorporating differentiated instruction in your classroom. So you see, frequently, people think that differentiated instruction means that there must be different groups doing different things because it comes from this name, differentiated instruction. But what I want to clarify for all is that let's not, it's actually very much more expensive than just differentiated, different groups doing different things. Okay, so if you look at the practices here, there are then many different kinds of practices. Proactive planning to cater to readiness, interest, learning profile, instructional needs based on students, instructional approaches based on students' needs. We teach up, which means, we don't meet them exactly where they are. We always pitch a little higher, so we stretch them up. We give them respectful tasks and flexible grouping. So these are the 3 pillars of differentiated instruction. So if there's something you want to take away today, it will be this image, okay, for what DI represents, as well as this, which is a different way of representing that. So as you see here, if we break it down in a different way, the 5 principles is over here. So DI is therefore a teacher's proactive response to learners' needs, and it's shaped by the mindsets. The mindsets will be the 4 philosophies that is mentioned in the previous slide. And then there are these 5 principles that I had mentioned as well. And then teachers can differentiate or play around with their classroom elements, what I call classroom elements, according to these 4 classroom elements. The content, which is what the information that your student learns, the process, which is how your students make sense of the content. In some ways, people think of it as the way in which you teach as well. The product, which means how students show the task, the assignment, what they've learned, and the effect of the environment. So these are the 4 classroom elements you can play around with. And when we play around with them, what are we doing? We're playing around with them based on students' needs. And students' needs can be broadly disaggregated into 3 main student traits. They would be readiness, interest, and learning profile. Okay? And then you see at the bottom here, Tomlinson puts all these strategies at the bottom. Okay, so if you have these on top here, if you know these principles and elements that you can play around with, then you can use your own strategies. You don't actually really need to use any of these strategies. In fact, later on you'll see that many of the strategies I use don't have anything to do with these instructional strategies at the bottom. Okay, so this is the big picture of what DI means. But what happens is that in my own work in looking at teachers' implementation of DI in primary and secondary schools in Singapore, they face quite some challenges with classroom size, with collecting enough assessment data, being prompt enough with using the assessment data to feed forward into the instruction. So there are some of these challenges that they face. So in light of that, I asked myself, how can I role model to students what ways in which we can overcome some of these. In which case, what I thought we could do is to use technology. So what I then do is I'm trying to merge, these technological pieces with DI and overlay it onto DI. So technology is helpful. Why? Because it can streamline information about students. It encourages inclusivity. It supports multimodal learning. Okay, by multimodal learning, we're talking about different modes of learning. It could be through blended, it could be through visual, it could be through audio, it could be through written and textual and so on and so forth. Technology also, as many of you would know by now, enables students to learn at their own pace and relearn when necessary. And then it's also to help us overcome formative assessment challenges, which I think is one of the major stumbling block of DI in a way. Okay, so I'm going to show you the next slide. Please don't be overwhelmed by it, okay? Okay, so you see, I had mentioned, right? Earlier on, I walked you through Tomlinson's model of DI. So this is, in a nutshell, how we can think about what DI is. Now, what is in this framework here is how I actually synthesize or overlay technology with different DI pieces. So for example, let's see. So for example, let's say content, okay? Playing around with content, right? Differentiating the content pieces, okay? What do I do with differentiating for content? Okay, what I do is to use Padlet to curate scaffolding materials for students. What does that mean? Because I know that some students are not familiar with certain aspects of education in Singapore or with writing. So I create Padlets that provide supplemental materials that they can actually look at on their own outside of the classroom. Content. I actually use music videos. I created my own music video to help students better remember the key concepts of DI so that they can listen to the music and remember the principles and philosophies of DI using music. Okay. Let's see what else. Assessment. So assessment is a big piece that informs teaching and learning, right? So then I use Google Forms to conduct pre and post surveys before the course. In the pre-survey, I can then collect information about the readiness of the students. And then when I'm actually teaching, I will know, okay, which students have some experience with differentiated instruction, which students have less experience with differentiated instruction, and so on and so forth. So this in blue, you will see are all the technological tools, okay, that I use around, okay, and how I use that to support differentiated instruction. Okay, so now, don't worry, I'm not going to just leave you with this picture. I'll go down into giving you examples of what these look like. Okay, so next one. So I'm going to talk about the first goal of my study, which is how I played around with using technology to enhance differentiated instruction, okay, in my classroom, and as well as to use that to teach differentiated instruction in my classroom to teachers who are learning that. So the first bucket of ideas that I'm going to share will be ideas around the use of assessment data to inform instruction. Okay, so as I had mentioned earlier already, I use Google Forms. Before students come to my class, I actually have them complete a pre-course survey. And in that pre-course survey, I'll ask questions like, okay, have you tried differentiated instruction in your own school setting before? If you have, what did you do? What do you understand by the principles of differentiated instruction? Why do you want to join this course? How much technology do you use? What technology do you use in the classroom? And then I ask things like, okay, in learning face-to-face, what are some instructional pedagogies or modalities that work for you? In learning via Zoom, what are some pedagogies or arrangements that works for you? And then what considerations do they like me to consider for group work? And then I'll always have one question at the end, which is there anything you want to let me know in the context of this classroom? And I always find that question, is there anything you want me to know in the context of this classroom, a very powerful question. Okay, all kinds of things will come up, okay, in that kind of a very open-ended. So when we do that, we actually then provide this space for students to feel safe already as we invite them in. And then what happens is that I will use this data to then feed forward in my instructional decision later in terms of how I group them, how I check in with them, how I invite students to come out to share about their own practices, and so on and so forth. Okay, next one. So in the middle of the teaching, I continue to collect formative assessment data so that I can then use it to inform my own instruction as well, right? So for that, I use formative.com, a web-based tool for formative assessment. So I can use that to create quizzes. The good thing about it is that when I import the class list in there and when students actually complete some of my quizzes, then right away it computates, for me, and I can see who is doing what and so on and so forth. So for example, one thing I do is I actually quiz students on my assignment instructions. Okay, and I say that because there's an assignment that they have to engage in, which is actually quite strenuous. They have to go out and collect data and profile a group of learners, all right? And then write about that, okay? But it's not strenuous just because of that. It's strenuous because they actually have to use the IRB, okay? Because they are collecting data, right, from learners. So they actually have to administer the NTU IRB to them. And as we all know as researchers, administering IRB, okay, is actually extremely challenging. So while I've pre-prepared the forms for my students, sometimes some of them can run into hiccups as well, or they don't understand it. So what I do is that I will actually record myself, okay? On the day that I'm introducing the assignment, I will log into Zoom and I will record myself at the same time talking about the assignment, okay? So that they can watch the assignments, the recording instructions later. And then after that, when they go back home, I will actually send them a formative assessment quiz, a short quiz to quiz them on what they're supposed to do. Okay. And then after that, I'll see, okay, somebody who got certain things wrong. Like the student says, okay, this student got it wrong. I need to include a cover sheet when I submit my assignment and turn it in. Okay. So because formative tells me this person got this question wrong, then what I can do is that I can use this pre-generated feedback, and I'll just key in and say, okay, look, you have to have every assignment has to come with a cover sheet and a generative AI form and turn it in and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are ways in which we can check in to ensure that students actually understand our instructions. These are ways in which we can use formative assessment data in all kinds of ways. Now, Plickers is a QR code, okay, which if we give every student a single QR code, they can keep the QR code with them. And the QR code actually has 4 sides to them, okay? So each of the 4 sides will be labeled like this is A, this is B, this is C, and this is D. So whenever we ask questions, multiple choice A, B, C, D, if the students thinks it's B, they'll turn the QR code around and then they'll hold it up. And what instructors can then do is to use our handphone, right, and do a quick scan around the classroom this way, and it picks up all the QR code right away. Okay. I use this, not a lot, but I use this as a way to showcase to my students that this is something that they can use in their own classroom as well. Okay. And why is that so? It's because in primary school setting, unlike in higher education classroom, not all students have access to a personal learning device, all right, where they can easily scan. So what is helpful then is that, teachers can then give them these QR codes. If you want to do it in a higher education setting, you can do that too. You can give every one of your students a QR code, which they will have to keep for the entire semester. So whenever you quiz them in the middle of the year, they can just hold up their QR code, and each of their personalized QR code will then be tied to their names, and it will generate the data for you very rapidly. So this is what I mean about technology being very helpful in generating formative assessment data, which we can then feed forward. Okay. So this is that for use of assessment data. Now, if you remember, one of the principles of differentiated instruction, other than that of using assessment information, is that of creating a supportive learning community. So this is a very big piece that I spend quite a bit of time thinking through about, because as I had mentioned, right, I don't see a lot of mixing in my class, and I really want to have a lot more integration and mixing in my class. And it troubles me also because sometimes when it comes to group work, I will see my international students do group work by themselves, and then the local students do group work by themselves, and then they don't mix and so on and so forth. So what in my mind I want to really do is to get them to mix as much as possible so that when they get into group work, it's based on their interests and their topics of choice rather than who they know. So that means that I have to start this community of them interacting in very strategic and explicit ways. So what I use is this idea of intentional and flexible grouping as a differentiated instruction practice, okay? Flexible grouping. What it does is to promote peer support and learning, and it changes up grouping every week according to our instructional plans. Okay, so my students takes maybe 2 to 3 weeks, and then they get used to it. They realize that every time they come into my classroom, because I only work in tutorial setting, unlike some of you who maybe work in a whole lecture setting of 100 of them, it's hard for you to do that, right? Okay, it is sort of possible if you break them into 3 main groups, like one block of you sit here, one block of you sit in the center, one block of you sit there. Okay, that's a possibility. But in my case, because I work with, tutorial group setting, 25, 30 students, so in the first session, when they come in, I would have already asked them where they live, okay, in the pre-survey form. And then I'll ask them to sit according to where they live in Singapore. So if you see over here, this is a sample map of telling them seating plan of where they're supposed to sit according to north, south, east, west, central in Singapore. And the reason why I do that is that during self-introduction, I'll actually then ask the students, how many of you actually drive? Okay, and if you drive, are you willing to give people a lift? Right? So they're supposed to talk about that as well. And the purpose of doing that is because, a lot of our students, at least for me, they are full-time instructors, and they come to NIE for their lessons at night from 6 to 9 p.m. But by the time they finish and they get home, some of them who live in Woodlands or in Pasir Ris, they get home at 11 o'clock. So it's really, really painful for some of them. I recognize that. So I sort of want to use this as an opportunity to help them carpool and get to know with each other. Okay, so that's that. On the first 2 weeks, I'll get them to sit together according to where they live in Singapore. And then after that, on other weeks, the week where I introduce a topic, the topic of DI, I will then look at my assessment, my pre-survey form assessment data to see who has actually practiced DI before in the classroom and who hasn't, who is more familiar and not. And then I will mix the grouping up such that they're in groups whereby some of them are more familiar and some of them are less familiar so that they can share with each other. Yeah. And then on another week where, maybe we're talking about instructional strategies of how to implement DI in a classroom, I will then break them up and say, now you're going to sit according to the subject that you teach. Those who teach English language will sit together, in science sit together, and so on and so forth. And then on another week, when we're talking about challenges with implementation in our institutional context, then I'll mix them up again and I'll say, okay, this week you're supposed to sit according to your institutional context. Okay, so all the nurse educators sit together, all the MOE teachers sit together, and so on and so forth in your discussion. So this is what we call flexible grouping. Okay, so in flexible grouping, we keep changing the grouping around each week according to the instructional needs, okay, for that day. And what is really helpful for this is that students really get to know each other after a while, okay? Now, what other things did I do to build a supportive learning environment? So, of course, in the first week, there will be class introductions, face-to-face class introductions. But before that, before they come into class, I actually have them introduce themselves on Padlet as well. So they have to have an introduction of who they are, put up a photo, say something personal about themselves, that most people don't know, and so on and so forth. Okay, and the reason for this is so that, often how our students work in groups, right? But they don't know each other's names and they may be embarrassed to ask the person what their names are after a while. So after that, they can go to Padlet and they're like, oh, the person I sat with is actually Vivian. My goodness gracious me, okay? So next time I know that's Vivian, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the next time they will not be so embarrassed, okay? So that's this purpose, okay, so that they can get to know each other. Another thing I do is that I actually have them in their Google spreadsheet write down their own background information about the subject they teach and the level they teach. And then over here, have them write their name and email. The reason being, when we have to get into groups for assignments, the first assignment is based on they have to I mentioned earlier, right? They have to go out and profile a learner. They got to go and find some learner or a group of learners and collect information about this learner. So some of them who are English teachers in primary school, right? They may not know who are the English teachers in the classroom. So they will look at this spreadsheet and say, oh, there's an English teacher here. Oh, that's Vivian, or that's Nadia, and I've been in the same, group with them in the classroom before. I'm sort of familiar. So then they can use this sheet to actually reach out to peers to form groups. So after they've formed groups already, then they're supposed to put in their names here in this column and give themselves a name. Okay, so I actually helped them set up this, I actually set up the scaffolding or the structure for them to get into group work. So there's this piece on building the learning community here, yeah? Now I'm going to move on to talk about the various ways in which the content or process can be differentiated. Okay, so I mentioned this briefly earlier already when I talk about scaffolding for content, and I said that I have international students, or I have students who are nurse educators who have been out of the MOE system for a long time already. They don't really know what's going on in the classroom context of education policy and so on and so forth. So I create a Singapore Education Resource Padlet to offer information on the Singapore education, so that I will tell students, have a read, poke through this, and get a sense of different elements in the Singapore education system. So for those of you, for the rest of you, I mean, if you're not in education, you can consider how can you create Padlets with content extension to support your students in certain ways that you feel that they need plugging in, especially in understanding some background information or social cultural context. So, within MOE, I mean, there's this love of acronyms, okay? MOE staff use a lot of acronyms. So sometimes, in discussions, students are really lost when there's a lot of acronyms used. So I actually put a list here of the abbreviations or acronyms that I use to help some of the students. Of course, at the same time, in the classroom, whenever acronyms are used, I do try to ask students to unpack the acronym as well. Now, the next thing is writing. We know that our students, many of our students have challenges with writing. And then for me, because I'm teaching at a master's level, so many of the students may not have written an essay for many years already. And it's actually very daunting for them to start writing essays again. So what I do is that I actually put in a writing resource Padlet for them, talking about APA citations, writing tips at the mechanics of writing, recommended books for writing. I video record, what they can think and do about writing and developing their arguments and so on and so forth. And I put it in there and I point them to it. So before their first assignment, I'll say, always remember to look at the writing resource Padlet. Typically, they don't. But after I've graded their first assignment and they get my feedback, but then when I say, go and look at the writing resource Padlet, then next they will look at the writing resource Padlet after getting all my feedback from the first round of grading. Okay, what else? In terms of supporting them in a content and process differentiation, so one of the assignments they have to do is to present an extension on one of the topics that's related to differentiated instruction. So we call it a special interest topics. So after I've taught whatever I've taught already, then I'll tell students, okay, you're going to have an assignment where you're going to present and research something that is, directly or indirectly related to this topic. So I want you all to propose topics. So I tell them, go and propose all the different topics that you have in a Google spreadsheet based on what you're interested in. So those who are interested in, they will propose. Some of them, they're easygoing, they don't care, they let other people propose. Okay, so these topics get proposed, we sort them out. And then after that, I'll put them, okay, so it looks like the different proposed topics are grouped around technology, assessment, social skills, and so on and so forth. So these are the different topics from a ground up perspective that y'all have proposed. Then I'll say, now team members or class, these are the different topics. Can y'all go and sign up as members? Okay, so this is how I get them organized again. So rather than, again, letting them get organized in terms of what they want to propose, get groups that they want to get into based on who they know, it's according to what topics that they're interested in. But I set up the structure for them to get to know each other that way. Next thing, process differentiation. I use a Google Sheet. So if you look over here, week 5, week 6, week 4, week 9, every week there's usually a Google Sheet. And in the Google Sheet, it actually captures some of the questions we discussed in the classroom. So in the classroom discussions, if they're actually broken up into groups for classroom discussions, each group I'll tell them, can you just have a scribe and write down some brief things about what you're discussed in the topic. Of course, they come together to share. But as we all know, sometimes the time runs out. right? And then we can't share every single detail. So students, when they go back home, they can actually refer to the spreadsheet to get a sense of what has gone on and what are the discussions in other groups. Okay, process differentiation, again, different modalities. I let them watch videos, I make the music video for them, and then they watch videos, and then they go on to a discussion board to discuss the video content, and I prompt them with questions in there, and that's the assignment. This one I discussed earlier already, which is that I actually video record my assignment instructions to them, and I post it online so that they can actually look at these assignment instructions again and again. And I was very shocked actually in my research when I found out that one student actually looked at the assignment instruction, the video 20 times, because the person wrote that in the qualitative feedback form. Okay, so this is how much they appreciate being able to look at assignment instructions. Product differentiation, offering them choice in terms of grouping, the topics that they choose, and so on and so forth. Okay, now in terms of findings, so how do students feel, when they experience these EdTech enhanced differentiated instruction? So across two modules that I taught, right? And this is by voluntary participation. So I was able to collect feedback from 32 participants. And these are the different kinds of data that I collected: pre-course survey, post-course survey, semi-structured interview with 19 of them, assignment reflections, and then classroom observation. And I want to say that what happens is that I actually do not know who's participating in my research at all, because all the data and the IRB forms are collected by my research assistant. And I only know who has participated after the scores have after the final grades have been locked into the EME system. Okay, so that is a part of the ethics process. So I'm not going to show you everything, every single thing, but I show you some key interesting responses. So this piece about Padlets. So there are two kinds of Padlets, right? There was the Padlet on the introduction. Okay, remember introducing students. Okay, so there's the class Padlet here. And the student says that it's a nice way to get to know everyone. It made it less intimidating to approach people. And then the Padlet for extension, content extension Padlet, like the writing Padlet and the Singapore education system Padlet. Students talk about it as being a good overview, especially for foreign students who are less familiar. And then in terms of the survey forms, so remember I have them do a pre-course survey and then a post-course survey. Actually, for the post-course survey, there are a small number of questions inside there that actually repeats. So when it's repeated, it's to actually help them examine their own views about differentiation and see how their own perspective about DI has shifted from pre-course to post-course. So as researchers, while we think that pre-post survey feedback can be important for us as researchers, it's actually arguably very, very powerful for learners as well, because they see their own shift in learning over time. Okay. So as my students say, okay, when they look at the post-course, they realize, oh, I've actually learned this much, and they know how much they've progressed. Now, in terms of the Go Formative, remember there was this formative.com tool that I use in collecting formative assessment data, where I set all kinds of quizzes for them. Students say that even then, the data actually helps them to assess their own understanding of the lesson and surface misconceptions as well. And then in terms of the use of Google Sheets, so the Google Sheets, so this was in terms of using the Google Sheet for assignment organization. Remember how they can find each other, get into groups, propose special interest topics, and so on and so forth. The students said that they found it especially effective in linking up people in a similar fields when they don't know each other. So they don't feel that it's so intimidating approaching somebody. They feel like, oh, everyone is doing the same thing. They're all approaching strangers anyway. So it's not just me. So it reduces that fear for them. Okay. And then using the Google Sheet, I was saying that every week I have a sheet that captures the group discussions where they do some scribing inside there. So the student says that it not only helps them jot down their thoughts and make it more coherent and concrete, but later on, if they can go and review other groups' ideas too, post-class, should they want to. And then recording assignment instructions, if you look here, Okay, 79% of them says very helpful. Okay, so they're able to refer back to the recording of the video's instructions again and again to help them. Okay, so just to wrap up then, okay, so participants are very appreciative of the use of DI principles and practices. Okay, and together with it, the affordances of technology as it is used to leverage, as technology is leveraged to help with differentiated instruction. So in the area of assessment, as I had shown, it really helps to streamline assessment data efficiently. It helps them in their own self-assessment as with helping us in assessing where they are at. Okay. And that self-assessment is important for our students to actually make sense of where they're weak at so that they can then move forward. Students also appreciated the different modalities to access information. So they appreciated that they can watch movies. So we talk about differentiated instruction and the practices, and then they watch a movie and then they discuss how some of the practices may or may not be evident in the movie. So that helps them apply their learning. And then they discuss the movie in a discussion board with each other rather than in the classroom. So that's a blended learning for them. They don't have to come to school for that. And then they felt that the EdTech tools were inclusive because it catered to different learning needs, like slow learner or having a short attention span or desiring different perspectives. In terms of differentiating process, like recording of instructions, Google Sheet, it really helps students to learn at their own pace. So when students go back, they want to actually refer to something that was discussed earlier that they have missed out. They can go back to looking at that, okay? And this part about being valued in a supportive learning environment. I think students really appreciate that, the learning environment, they call it like a family and friends. They feel like every week when they come into the classroom, there's the excitement because they don't really know where to sit, right? They may be placed with someone else whom they are not familiar with, but every week they get to meet somebody new. And then because of that, they find that they form very much stronger friendships in the classroom. So there is this right potential for DI as a pedagogical framework to contemplate how we can engage with diverse students. I do want to say that I think as faculty members, what we want to do is to really think about the philosophy and principles and really take that away rather than only think about the practices. We can use EdTech to complement DI because of its inclusivity, immediacy, and individuality. And I want to give this caveat before I end off, which is that you don't have to feel like you need to use all these practices or tools in one module that you teach. The reason why mine is so intense and there's so many things going on in one module is because I am also trying to role model this practice and teach part of these practices and content to my students so they can apply it in their own classroom. But for many of you, you don't come from an education background. You're not teaching in an education school. So you may want to just pick and choose what you think are helpful for you. Now, if you want more ideas, I leave this website with you. So some of the ideas that I have shared, I actually put this into a website already because this was actually funded by the I3G grant. So one of the outputs was actually to set up a website. So I have this website here to show how some of these pieces can be used. As of last night, I checked the QR code and linked and it worked. But at 10:45 a.m. this morning, I realized that there was an issue and it kept telling me database error. I have already pinged my IT folks at NIE to ask them to help troubleshoot this. So I'm not sure when it will be troubleshooted. Maybe it has already been troubleshooted while I'm doing this. So lastly, these are references. And if you have any questions, I think we have about 12 minutes. So I'm going to stop sharing now, yeah? Alvin?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Thanks. Okay, so if I can just jump in on behalf of everybody, initial preliminary thanks very much to you, Tang. No pun intended on your name. I'm sure it gets said all the time. But yeah, very grateful, very appreciative for pulling together such a balanced sharing, both in terms of the research and the pedagogy, as well as some very practical, easy to implement Padlet tools. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to, if I can trouble Uni to help put the feedback link into the chat in case anybody needs to proceed to other engagements after this. As she does that, we can move on to the question and answer segment. We had two questions, Prof. Heng, if you will, inside.
In the
One of
chat
them
box,
is
yeah?
more, theoretical. One of them is more practical. Perhaps we can take it in that order because Delia, who put in the theoretical question, put it in really, really early. She's curious about the difference between UDL, Universal Design, and
Yes. Okay. So this is a very common question around UDL and DI. And funnily, sometimes, I think the UDL folks get very annoyed about this when they're asked these questions, because I once attended a UDL workshop and the person, when faced with that, she's like, this question again. Okay. So let's talk about the history of UDL and or how it came about versus DI. I would say UDL has its roots both in architecture and in brain-based design, okay, in brain-based learning. So this idea of universal design for learning has this idea in architecture, which is that when we design a space, a learning space, how can we remove all barriers, okay, for all learners such that they are able to get through to a space? It's kind of like when we have a building, okay, we have steps, but steps may actually pose as a barrier to people going into the building. Now, if we build a ramp up into a building, okay, it opens up the space for everybody. Okay, people who have problems, who have weak joints and knees, they have trouble with steps, they can go up the ramp. Wheelchair bound people can go up the ramp. People with disabilities can go up the ramp. And then mothers with prams or strollers, they can go up the ramp as well. So using that same architectural idea when applied to learning design, it's about that removal of barriers. So if that's the case, the question is, how can we remove as many barriers to learning for your students as possible? So if you think about it, that actually in some ways overlap with one of the DI philosophy of removing barriers for access for learners, correct? So it does ask of you to think about, okay, what can I do? In which case, maybe some of the barriers is if I'm teaching online, and some of my students have trouble with hearing. So what can I do is and some of them have trouble with hearing because they need a hearing aid. Some of them actually, they have trouble with the accent. Some of them, they have trouble if someone speaks too fast, like me, and so on and so forth, right? So if we simply turn on closed captioning, if I'm doing Zoom or in classroom teaching, just simply turning on that closed captioning actually then removes that barrier to learning for many, many different people already. So that's a way in which, that's one of the major principles of UDL. I think the other part about UDL is also, it draws very much on brain-based research as well, in recognizing that the brain requires different kinds of modality for learning. So there is that overlap over there. Where I see there are differences would be, I think, in the case of differentiated instruction talks a lot about assessment, okay, formative assessment and the use of formative assessment. In UDL, I think in the framework, that is not as explicitly emphasized. That's one thing. So quite frankly, I will not sweat it, UDL, DI, whatever works for you and your students, because behind it, at the heart of it, is this notion of learner-centeredness, seeing learning from where your students are at and working with that. Okay? So I hope I answer your question on that, Delia. And then Ming Hui has a question next, is it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, his is a more practical slant. He's wondering with the number of tools and everything that you use, they might have trouble tracking either the admin side, maybe the different user accounts, or the data that comes out of it. So I hope I captured that correctly, Ming Wei. Please correct me.
I want to understand more learner responses to the behaviors. Yeah, so I really think it depends on your setting already. So in my context is smaller, correct? My context is that I'm working with 25 to 30, all right? Or sometimes at most 36 students, So within that kind of a context, it's easier for me to look across, let's say, who has actually introduce themselves on Padlet, right? Who has introduced themselves on Padlet. But then when I find that if I want to pinpoint and collect very precise data about something, about whether everyone has actually learned the principles of DI well, or understood the philosophies of DI, or actually understood my assignment instruction and so on and so forth, then in that case, I will not use Padlet, because Padlet doesn't really offer that modality of being able to churn the data for me. I will then use something like Formative.com, which then allows churns the data and give me, question by question and person by person breakdown of their responses. So I really do think that we need to figure out which technology has what affordances. That said, I do think there is something that is necessary. Sometimes it'll be really nice if NTU can help us purchase some of these things, some of these software. I mean, for Formative.com, I actually use that and I could access that because of my grant, right, with this research. But when it ended, then I will have certain functionalities that are curtailed subsequently. Yeah.
Yeah, we hope that answered your question. Please correct us.
I think is Padlet. Is there NTU access to Padlet? I know that there's NIE access to Padlet.
Yes,
there's NTU access to Padlet as well, right?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Yes. So it's supported both in terms of tech support and there's an institutional account.
Yeah.
You can incorporate it seamlessly into PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, and Mentimeter as well, if I'm not wrong, right? Or WooClap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I believe another Delia has led a follow-up comment. Perhaps you could take a look at it. It's in the main chat as well.
Delia says that, so for UDL, they say, think of the UDL as tier 1 preemptively to meet the needs of most learner by removing that barrier for all, right? And then DI as tier 2 for more targeted for students with specific needs in the classroom. I think you can do that as well. I don't see why not, because DI, if you want to target that way, you could. I would say UDL, if you want to target along particular ways, that is possible as well, no? Yeah. Let's see, hang on. In your experience, I can through. You're asking, has UDL practices been established in a classroom prior to DI? So I would say no. And I think there's a reason for that. The reason is because differentiated instruction got picked up as one of 6 priority areas for SkillsFuture for MOE. And once it got picked up by MOE, so many schools then start using DI straight away. I would say that where I've seen UDL picked up is mostly in schools for students with special needs. So schools for students with special needs, many of them actually implement the UDL philosophy and practices. MOE classroom, I think some schools do implement UDL as well, but as far as I know, they do not strictly do UDL first, then DI second. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let's see. So those are the questions that we have in the chat. Can I invite those in the room who probably are still thinking of some questions? Could you either raise your hands or maybe just turn on your mic and introduce yourself and you can ask the question.
I just say something quickly.
Of course.
My NIE IT tech person teams me and said that the website is okay already. They managed to get the website up, the one that I shared earlier. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for the update. It's reassuring. Questions from the folks?
Yes, thank you very much. So
hi, Prof. Tang. Sorry.
Hi. I saw your comment in the chat box. Hi.
Yeah. Yes, hi. Yeah, I saw a comment. So sorry to interrupt the last minute session.
No worries. Yes.
So previously, I just want to share my inputs that I used to teach at with students from higher SES. Really helpful for them to use Kahoot, Padlet as well. But my concern is this, because for the period now, I'm actually so-called volunteering with CDAC. So there are students with lower SES. That when I use this modality, when these modes of EdTech, they are
Mm,
not so encouraged to use. Probably
mm,
they might have not much to share. So, no, Prof, I have a question.
mm,
How do EdTech will then encourage them to participate? That's my question.
mm. So I'm curious with this phrase, not much to share. So I think when students from low SES, they do not participate, right, through the EdTech modality, we need to ask ourselves why. So actually OECD's work on the looking at EdTech and education, there's actually a very long tail involved, with in the sense that it means that students with low SES actually in a way don't do as well in learning with EdTech setting. And one part of that's why I asked then, what is the reason behind why they're not sharing? If they're not sharing because it's a structural barrier, okay? By structural barrier, I mean they don't have access to personal learning mobility device or access to Wi-Fi and systems and so on and so forth, then in a way that can really impede their learning. So when teachers actually set up, let's say, assignments in the classroom and say, okay, just go online and follow up with this at home, right? But if students have to wait for their parents to come home, there's only one handphone at home and have to wait for their parents to come home at night after finish working, then the students will actually get impeded that way. So as it is then our responsibility in a way as teachers to check in on students to find out how they have such access at home so that technological access is not an impediment for them. So that's a possible impediment. The second impediment is that of confidence. I don't know why are they not sharing and typing online and saying more. Does it have to do with not being able to type fast enough? Does it have to do with language? Fear of being laughed at in terms of what they say? Does it have to do with the ideas that they feel that they don't have the ideas? I'm not sure what is the reason. That's the reason why I think that the assessment is important, because we need to do the diagnostic of why is it that they are not, contributing. Okay, and I think we need to then sit down and ask them, okay, can you have a chat of, why do you think it's so hard for you to contribute? Okay, and it's only when we understand why it's hard for them to contribute, then can we figure out what is the best solution to that. So that diagnostic, again, I think is quite important there. So you might want to have a chat with your students to ask, what are some of these issues that you're facing? Is it a language thing? Is it an idea thing? And so on and so forth. If it's an idea thing, then what we have to do next is to help them make the bridging across what you're trying to teach or what you're trying to elicit with their own context or their prior knowledge. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Use of devices can be a gateway to digital distraction. Tips. Oh my goodness gracious me. This is such a difficult one. I really grapple with that. And I talk to teachers, classroom teachers, and they are grappling with that because, they go around the classrooms, the students, they're very smart. They open many browsers. So every browser becomes very, very small. So the teachers cannot see that one of the browsers is actually a browser where they're gaming. Okay, so some of the things that I've seen in the classroom, I don't know how this might work in the higher education setting, okay? It's that when they're not taking notes and they don't need the laptop, the teachers actually ask the students to actually turn the laptop around to face them at an angle. Or they will say that, I would like everybody's laptop to be closed down at 3/4 angle, your screen to be closed down at 3/4 angles, or just to lay it flat and so on and so forth, as by way of managing that distraction. But really, this thing on a gateway to digital distraction, yes, I do agree that it is very problematic. That's the reason why I offer the manual Plicker.com as a formative assessment tool, because Plicker, all you do is you have this QR code, which is you give it to them and they have to use the QR code. So no personal learning device is used on that front. Yeah, that's it. Then it does means that there will be some functionalities curtailment that way because you can only use MCQ questions and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think we can go on about the many issues, the pros and the cons that digital devices come about. I think I'm just mindful of the time that is slightly past 12 already. So for the benefit of those who do need to rush off, can I just bring this session to an official end and with the feedback link that's put out there. So please do share with us your feedback and some of the questions that I think Dr. Heng is interested to be able to hear from you also. So please use that link inside, and perhaps we can use the chat, or you can turn on to officially thank Dr. Heng for her time and her sharing of expertise.
Thank you everyone for being present today. Appreciate your time.
Yes, and Dr. Heng, if it's not too much of an imposition, maybe if you could stay around.
Yeah, I'll stay around for a couple of minutes. No worries.
Awesome stuff. So if any of us do have further questions, I know I have one or two of my own. Feel free to just stay on. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day for those who are leaving us now.